Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Lawton. I'm the managing editor of Religion and Ethics NewsWeekly, the show on PBS. And joining me is my friend and colleague, Pat Zaper from Catholic News Service. We are at the Mullen Memorial Library at the Catholic University of America for this discussion. It's a really interesting time in the Roman Catholic Church. We watched the Pope ride off into the sunset. We have a Pope Emeritus right now and no Pope in office. We have cardinals gathering in Rome to make the selection for the new Pope. And we thought it would be interesting to have a lot of voices weigh in on what those cardinals should be considering as they make their momentous choice. We've got a great group with us to talk about these things. I'll give you a brief introduction of everyone. Right to my left is Ambassador Miguel Diaz. He's the most recent ambassador to the Holy See, now university professor of faith and culture at the University of Dayton. Prior to his Vatican appointment, Dr. Diaz taught theology at the College of St. Benedict in St. Joseph, Minnesota, and St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. A prominent Catholic theologian, Dr. Diaz was the first Hispanic to represent the United States at the Vatican. Last fall, he helped the Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group of the Secretary of State's Strategic Dialogue with Civil Society. That's a mouthful. Next to him, we have Dr. Margaret Milady. She is the vice chair of the Board of Trustees of the Catholic Distance University, which through distance education helps people worldwide learn about theology, liberal arts, and faith development. From 1997 to 2003, Dr. Milady served as president of the American University in Rome, Italy's first American independent degree-granting university. She's the author of 6 books on political and cultural studies, including her book, The Rhetoric of Pope John Paul II. Next to her, we have Dr. Stephen Schneck. He's director of the Catholic University of America Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies, and he's acting dean of the School of Social Work. He's directed that institute since 2005. He comes from a background in political science, having served as chairman of the Department of Politics at the Catholic University of America for 9 years. His research is in the field of political philosophy and on the role of religion in a democracy. And then we have Kim Daniels. She is coordinator of Catholic Voices USA, whose website describes its mission as to put the church's case in the public square. The website adds they offer a new apologetics for the new evangelization. Kim Daniels is an attorney whose practice has focused on religious liberty issues, particularly rights of conscience and health care. But today, of course, we're talking issues all Pope. And so I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Pat, to tell us a little more about how we got started.
Okay, this panel came about as a result of an interview I did with Ambassador Diaz just after the Pope announced that he would be resigning. Ambassador Diaz was very passionate about the idea that Catholics should spend this period of both Lent and the interregnum between popes in a posture of prayer and dialogue about the direction of the Church, perhaps to help the shape of the cardinal electors. With the talk worldwide now focused on who next to lead the Church, we wanted to bring together this group of people for just such a conversation, as the ambassador suggested. These 3 other thoughtful people, we hope, will lead this discussion down an interesting path. So I want to start with the first question to the ambassador, to Miguel. So let's start here. After eras when heads of government had veto power over the papal selection, canon law now prohibits direct involvement by other than cardinals in a papal election. But what does canon law or the catechism say about the idea that lay people might offer their guidance in these matters?
What I say here today, I say it as an educator, as someone who deeply loves and cares for this church and for the future of humankind. And so in that spirit, I think of the words of the Second Vatican Council in the Pastoral Constitution of the Church, Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 37. And in that paragraph, I quote, "By reason of the knowledge, competence, or preeminence which they have, the laity are empowered, indeed, sometimes obliged, to manifest their opinion on those things which pertain to the good of the Church." And I think that what moment for all of us, to express, what is clearly something that pertains to the good of the Church. That is the election of the next Pope. And so I hope that our conversation here today will prompt some thoughtful discussion and offer some ideas to all of our leaders. And in particular, later on today, I have, as a university professor who has worked so much with youth, I'm going to invite the youth of the world to tweet one word that they see would characterize, they would want in the next pope. And so, the church is in the hands of our youth, and we need to reach out to them, into the new generation, and the next leader of the church has to be able to connect with the youth, and with everyone, of course. But I think that our conversation here today is a wonderful opportunity to start that process.
Well, should we ask all our panelists for one word? You guys could tweet out loud here. But no, I would like to hear from each of you. Obviously, we could talk forever about it, but maybe tick down a list, just very briefly, of the qualities, the issues you hope would be foremost, the kind of person the Cardinals will pick. Why don't we just go down the line real quickly? Margaret?
I would pick joy. I think, our church, it really needs that energy and that joy. And I think when we look back on popes, we think about John the 23rd, for example. He had this wonderful joy. Everyone wanted to hug him, and he wanted to hug everyone else. And I think that's what we need. We need to have that spirit as we now go to Easter, for example. That road to Emmaus when the disciples realized this was Christ and how wonderful it is. And we should be absolutely so joyful and excited about telling our story of Christ and Jesus that that's the kind of, I think, what we need in the next Pope.
Great. Steve?
I think that maybe the additional word that I'd add to joy is mediator. Right now the church in the world and in the United States is a complex thing. It's divided north and south. It's divided east and west. It's divided between its liberal wings and its conservative wings. And it seems to me that this particular moment in history, Kim, is a moment when we need a pope who's able to bridge all of that, to speak to all of those different audiences.
My word would be confidence, I think. And I say that because I believe that Catholics are hoping for a leader who confidently engages the world, unafraid to proclaim church teachings even when they're countercultural, not necessarily accommodating ourselves, to a tired and often isolating culture, but in fact engaging that culture. And the way we engage that culture is through bringing the message of Jesus Christ and friendship with Jesus Christ. That was certainly a message of this last pontificate of Benedict. We find that joy and we find that mediation and the unity through the person of Jesus Christ and also through the person of the Pope. And I think that's what we're looking for, is a person who can convey this confidence.
I really think that we need a pastor because there's so much suffering in the church. And that suffering that has to be healed, not just within the church, but within society. Because the Pope is not just a healer of Catholics, but a world figure. So a pastor, a diplomat, to deal with and to constructively relate to the tremendous diversity that is all around us. And then I said a thoughtful and wise administrator to abundantly tap into the abundant gifts that the church has, both financially speaking and humanly speaking, and to empower those gifts for the sake of the common good.
How about some of the concrete functional characteristics that you might like to see in a pope? We've had two academics, the last two popes, and there's been all sorts of debate out there about whether it should be somebody who's another academic, whether it's somebody who's got more pastoral experience, whether it should be mostly an administrator to clean up problems. What are some of the things that you think are the skills that this person will need? Margaret, let's start back here.
Well, there's no question that, you have to have some administrative skills. But being an administrator, you really have to pick your people. You have to be really sure about the people who are going to be around you, surrounding you. And you have to take some risks sometimes. When I say that, for example, look at the papacy of John Paul II. He chose a layperson to be really in charge of his media relations. And that, I think, was really going out on a limb at that time. No one else had done that before. So I really think that you have to choose the very best people to surround you, to help you, to not only in policy and to advise you, but to actually take control. And I think sometimes you have to look to some people who are going to be tough.
I represent a lay organization, and I think that what people are looking for, what the laity are looking for, just what you're talking about. Of course, reform and renewal are essential, and we need to be able to execute that, and so that's important. But as Benedict just recently said, just over the past few days, the church isn't an organization. We're a faith. We're a community of believers, a community of brothers and sisters, and what we need in a leader is holiness and personal witness and personal friendship with Christ. That kind of example at the top will distribute down through the church, will be a witness for people. And it's that witness that I think we need. We've needed reform throughout the church's history. Certainly that's essential today, but holiness is what the essential factor is.
I'd like to see somebody who has some real pastoral experience.
Yes.
You know, somebody that's run a parish and had to deal with the problems that people have in their daily lives as Catholics. I think that would be a wonderfully precious, part of the background of a really good pope at our time.
Absolutely.
The church is not a democracy. And speaking as a theologian, I always say, of course the church is not a democracy. But the church is called by the Spirit of God to exist as God exists, in a communion, in a giving and receiving from others. This is part of the heart of the church. This is what makes the church be what it is that giving and receiving, that tapping into the richness, the ability to empower the right minds and the right hearts to lead the church forward. I mean, this is what makes the church, or what ought to make the church stand out at its best, when it comes to, different times in history. And whenever it has done that, my gosh, the gifts that are here in education, in humanitarian assistance, we can go down the list. They're enormous, but it's always a question. Good leadership has to tap and empower those gifts.
When I hear all of this, I hear he needs to be a pastor, pastoral experience, and an administrator, and a diplomat, and a good shepherd, and all of that. I mean, have the expectations become so huge? Is this a job any human being really can do? Benedict said in his own retirement that he didn't have the strength anymore to do this. And in our global world where we have these expectations immediately, the Pope is going to speak about this or do this or go here and go there. Is that something the cardinals have to take into mind? Who has the stamina to do this as well? I mean, it's really practical, but is that important?
That was one of the Twitter words that I would have used, and that's energy. I mean, we're going to need a pope that has some energy to tackle all of this and to be what we expect him to be. And unfortunately, when you look at the pool, you look at people who are, advancing in age, who are wonderful and could be really excellent choices. But I think, maybe we have to, maybe we have to lower our sights a little bit.
Well, and what are the pros and cons of a younger versus an older? The energy is one issue, but there's a whole class of
a long time in service,
there.
Right, and so I think that this is part of the weighing in, because oftentimes we all hear conversations, well, a younger pope might have more energy, but then a longer papacy, an older pope may not have the energy, but a shorter papacy. And so I think that this is part of the ongoing discernment of the cardinals, of the church, that the church needs at this time. I personally think that Pope Benedict has given a wonderful, has really humanized the papacy by stepping down, because he's not only given permission to other popes and other religious leaders, but really to all of us to think about, when is it that for the sake of the common good, we ought to, say, well, I can't do this. I need somebody else to step into the...
And hasn't that been striking? I think over the past few days, what we've seen, you talk about the superhuman expectations we have for the Pope, the upcoming Pope. But I think what's been striking to listen to Benedict over the past few days is to hear how often he refers to humility, but also to St. Peter and on the Sea of Galilee, and the fact that sometimes it's rocky and sometimes it's calm, right? Yes. And St. Peter, of course, is one of the most human figures in the gospel. And I think at the end of the day, it is a superhuman task. It's a human being who will be filling it, but obviously with the grace of Christ. And so at the end of the day, I think that we can set all these expectations and look for all these factors, but what we're looking for, again, is holiness.
I'd like to speak for the old guys, too. I think this idea that they have to be, you know, in their 50s or, you know, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think there's plenty of vitality that, you know, even among some of the, you know, the oldest members of the conclave. So.
I agree.
Agree.
And what about just geographical diversity? That's another thing a lot of people are talking about. Should it be a young pope, older pope? Should it be a pope from a different part of the world than we've seen before? If that were to happen, if the cardinals were to choose someone from Latin America, Africa, how might that shape the future of the church?
As a teacher, one of the images that I always use when I come into a classroom is I put an object in the middle of the classroom and I ask the students to spread out to different parts of the classroom and to describe the object, to think about the object, and then to come together and describe what they saw. And it's an exercise of perspective. It's an exercise, but also beyond perspective, it's an exercise to get them to realize that they need one another in order to have a fuller picture of that reality. Undoubtedly, someone who comes from South America, for instance, may have a consciousness of Medellin, may have a consciousness of the extreme poverty, may have a consciousness that has grown out of the intercultural, interreligious, interracial history, both good and not so good, in Latin America. And that obviously can contribute to the universal good of the church. But or someone who comes from Africa would have other characteristics there. I have tried to say, once the person steps into this position of leadership, he becomes a pastor of the universal church. At least that's the way that I like to go with this question around characteristics, traits, holiness, pastoral gifts, administrative gifts. And pray and fast that the cardinals then listen, to each other, to the voices of faithful Catholics, and act accordingly.
Also, I think, though, you raised a very good question about perspective. And I think the perspective of perhaps choosing an African pope, for example, of people in Africa would be a tremendous, I think, wonderful feeling that they would have, that that one of them have come to this wonderful and high state as a holy man. And I think, and I remember going back into when we had the first cardinal from Tanzania. This was a tremendous boon to the African church. And I think, in a way, we have to look at it from that point of view as well. I think it would be an extremely important, give some energy to the African population and the African church.
I think, ironically, to have a pope from the global south would also be a real key to the new evangelization, which has been such a theme of the past two popes. And that, of course, is rekindling the faith in cultures that have grown indifferent to it in the West, in these secular cultures that we all live in here. I think to have a pope from the global south would show the universality of the church and would really demonstrate and bring light to the enthusiasm and energy that's going on around the world.
That leads to another question about the new evangelization. That was always, Benedict always said that the new evangelization is the fulfillment of the Second Vatican Council. Where does the new evangelization lead? How does the new pope get the church there? Will the geographic location of the pope make that much of a difference? Talk about that a little.
Well, I think the new evangelization has to reflect the global character of the current church. So the church today, of course, is growing most quickly in places like Africa and Asia. But at the same time, many of the problems that the church is facing most acutely, problems of secularism, for example, are found in Europe and the United States, among other places. So I think the new evangelization has to have a foot in both camps. For it to be effective, it has to, in a sense, be a witness in these areas where the church is growing, as well as reaching out to mediate, to go back to a word that I used before, to mediate the kinds of divisions that have emerged.
I'd again return to that word confidence. I think that the new evangelization will happen if we confidently engage the world wherever we are. If we move past this tired paradigm that pits left and right Catholics against each other. That was a real theme, again, of Pope Benedict, right? Was that and especially in the past few days, talking about unity, talking about moving past ideology and engaging the world. And I think that you see in young Catholics a real willingness to stand up for the voiceless and the vulnerable wherever we find them, whether that be the unborn child and her mother, or whether it be the poor or the immigrant or what have you. That kind of unity is really engaging to people. You see it at the World Youth Day, you see it at the March for Life, and I think that'll be key to the new evangelization.
And for me, one of the, I speak from experience, one of the great inspiring aspects of Catholic faith in my life was, the invitation to embrace the relationship between faith and reason, the invitation not to be afraid, to ask the difficult questions, even if at the end of the day I do not have all the answers. The invitation to engage, not withdraw from the challenges that confront us. And I think that the best of the Catholic tradition is that kind of engagement with the world, with the sciences, with the with politics, with everything, because there is, in that sense, it's not a self-righteousness, but it's the humility to say, as the Council says, the Church is both teacher and learner. As an expert of humanity, it is called to both teach and learn from others, not only from Catholics, not only from religious persons, but wherever truth and goodness and beauty can be found.
Let me bring up a difficult issue, certainly one that's been at the forefront here in the U.S., the sex abuse crisis and the handling of that in various quarters, especially at the Vatican level. I hear a lot here from people saying they hope that that's something the cardinals take into account. Will they pick someone that may take a different tact on that issue or move it in a different direction? But is that an issue in other parts of the world? I mean, is this something you all think will be in the minds of the cardinals?
I think it's clearly a great betrayal and clearly a great tragedy that's happened over the past decades, and certainly essential for whoever is the next pope to make sure that we move with justice through this issue. And at the same time, I think it's important to recognize, particularly in the United States over the past 10 years, that a lot of good has been done. As a mother of 6 children in Catholic schools, I can tell you the difference between the way we handled who works in schools and who gets to coach CYO teams and serve at lunch duty between my oldest child and my youngest is much different. And those schools now are places, and always have been, of course, of love, but we're all assured with confidence again of the safety and the fact that the church is really watching this issue. It's a hinge moment, and I think to talk about the new evangelization, the key is to move past this issue with justice and love.
And I would agree that when I mentioned the characteristic of a pastor in healing and forgiving, this has been a great tragedy. And as a father of 4, who've had to really deal with this subject in the home because of the way that the subject has been covered widely, both in the press and in the church, clearly this is an issue that, and it's not just in the United States, it's an issue that is beyond just the church in the United States. And yes, we do need a pope who will continue to address this issue justly and with an open heart and mind. And again, tap into the resources available to the church to make sure that we're doing everything we can. We're not the only ones, clearly, that are involved in this tragedy, but that we are doing everything we can, perhaps, to model a way or to teach a way or to express how we might get out of this mess. And so, again, this is something that it's all around us, and the pain is there, and we can see it day in and day out. And it's part also of a broader, I think, conversation on human sexuality that we need to have, frankly, in society with our kids in our homes, because it's not just one issue, it's part of a broader issue of how we approach, human relations, human sexuality, and the topics that relate to that central aspect of human existence.
I think every institution, not just the church, but every institution is looking at its weaknesses now and trying to assess them and trying to make sure that they can safeguard the institution in terms of doing the right thing, approaching this in a very just but in a forceful way. And I think, therefore, I think the next pope has to address that in terms of setting the goals, setting the priorities, not only with that particular issue, but with all the issues in the church in terms of whether it be, issues in the banking of the Vatican or whatever issues there are. I think that there has to be some real clear setting of priorities and making sure that we assess those weaknesses and let's make it a stronger church and stronger institution.
One priest who I consulted, whose ideas I thought about this, I asked for this event, observed, the increasing coverage of the scandals in Great Britain, Los Angeles, and the Curia raised the stakes for the only cardinal with experience in cleaning house, is his words, namely Sean Patrick O'Malley. Do you think this is an area to which the cardinals will pay much attention? Should they? Somebody with administrative experience of that sort, do you think that that is something that they should worry about?
I'm not sure that the actual administrative experience is necessary, but I do think this is an issue that we can't simply put behind us. It's an issue that that needs to be confronted, from the get-go. I don't think this should be the issue that defines who should become pope at all, not by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think that whoever the new pontiff is going to be will have to, from the day one, address this forthrightly.
We talked about what it would be to have a pope from Latin America or Africa. She raises a point. What about one from the U.S.? How would that shape things? How would that shape things here?
It'd be very difficult.
Yeah, it really would be.
He said it would be difficult. Why would it be difficult?
Well, I think that there are a number of issues that have to do with the role of the United States regionally and globally, and it really has to also do with the way that the United States is perceived, rightly or wrongly, both regionally and internationally. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be a very difficult task for the Pope to be that closely identified with the superpower.
Yeah, I think that's the whole issue. I mean, let's face it. We are the superpower, and at the moment, and it's very difficult. I think, even historically, if you look at it from the point of view of the papacy. For the papacy to bring someone in who is the superpower of the world at this particular time, maybe it's a little bit too wedded to the political issues and the political stance of the world. So I
agree with you, Margaret, but I think that there is a chance. I mean, I can see, things have changed. I mean, history has changed. We're no longer the superpower that we were in 1995. Of course.
Right.
Of course. And and there's been leadership in the church provided by the American Cardinals. So, if things get deadlocked at the top, I could see the possibility. Slim, I agree with both of you, but I could see the possibility of someone like Cardinal O'Malley or Cardinal Dolan rising to the top.
And we are a nation, after all, that, this great foundational principle, e pluribus unum, we are a nation of immigrants. We are a nation that, in many ways, our pastors, at their best, are attuned to the great diversity that constitutes the United States of America. And so from that perspective, the person already has an inside view into the world, into the Catholicity, with a little c there, that is the universality of the human family.
And they're also keyed into the new evangelization that we've been talking about.
Right,
and I think
exactly.
that's very important.
I agree with you.
We've never had an American pope, obviously, and so we could be an Italian, right? Why not move over? Why not move over to North America? And,
well, as a practicality, both of you have been at the Vatican. Your husband was ambassador there. Can you see that happening? Is it something that would fly with a curia that is still predominantly Europeans?
Well, that may be true, but I think the Curia and this, you probably have a more up-to-date position on this, but I really think that, again, they realize that they are the universal church, and there are many, many nationalities working in the Curia. And so I think, in a sense, they would be open to others. Now, whether it would be an American or not, I'm not sure.
So we have solicited questions from our small audience here and from the public, so I want to throw a couple of those at you. This one of the major accomplishments of Vatican II was the establishment of collegiality in the governance of the Church through the National Episcopal Conferences. Unfortunately, this structure was not maintained and not to be restored, and needs to be restored to lessen the power of the Curia. How does that happen? Do you agree that it needs to happen?
Well, you know, one of my favorite theologians is actually an Orthodox theologian, John Zizioulas, begins his book, Being as Communion, with a powerful quote. And he says, the church is not just an institution. The church is called to exist in a communion of persons. And that's why I love this image of giving and receiving from others. And so that touches upon this kind of collegial dimension where there is oneness as diversity. In the Petrine ministry of oneness as diversity that is so essential for the church. And so, you know, I think that, you know, I like to hear from my friends, but I think that there is surely the capacity of the church to incorporate more and more the gifts available within the Episcopal conferences, within, you know, the particularities of each Episcopal conference, etc., for the sake, again, of the common good. Not for the sake of dividing, but for the sake of, you know, building up the body.
Anybody else want to add to that? Should we move on? It brings up a question for me in the mention, we've mentioned a couple of times about Vatican II, and certainly in the U.S., at least, there are differing interpretations of the legacy of Vatican II, and you talk to different people and they point to different things. What will it mean to have a pope who wasn't part of Vatican II, and how will that affect life moving forward?
I think that's an interesting question, Kim. I mean, if most of the cardinals are of an age where Vatican II is still, you know, a big part of their of the formation of their theological and church understanding of things. But you're right, Vatican II is now quite a ways behind us in the rearview mirror. And you know, I was heartened by the fact that Benedict XVI talked about his own papacy as a continuation or a completion of what Vatican II was about. And one way to think about the new evangelization is in those terms. But you're right, I think that we're you know, at a point where the legacy of Vatican II you know, needs to be redefined.
You know, I think also it needs to be studied more.
Well
really,
said,
because I've talked to some young people who are very fine Catholics, but they know nothing about Vatican Council II. And we who were born and brought up in that era and listened to what was going on during those years, I think are more know a little bit more than our other Catholics, and I think we really do need to study it more.
I think it also really shows what a hinge moment this is in history, right?
Yes.
That we're really
Yes.
moving
Well,
past
I'm
into
agree with
another
that.
era,
Yes.
and an era that will be one of this new evangelization. We've had since Vatican II this idea of continuity and reform, right? Reform and continuity, and I think that we're moving forward now. We know that we have the teachings of the church to continue in their fullness, and it'll be a real hinge moment.
It's sort of like the best kept secret. Catholics also teaching that Vatican II is becoming the best kept secret.
Yes,
Circles.
it's true.
Because you're right. I mean, many students,
know
you know,
nothing.
they don't know that,
Yeah.
but they also don't know many other things too,
True.
including some foundational biblical
We
texts.
have a lot to do with new evangelization, that's for sure.
This was another question somebody offered to me. Will the next pope be focused on restoring Catholic traditions or interpreting our faith in terms of today's culture? And that, I assume, would include interpreting Vatican II and teaching Vatican II.
Yeah, I always like to, I'm a good Catholic and I'm Cuban American, and I've always said that as a Cuban American, I love to live life on the hyphen. And I do not like either or perspectives.
Yes.
And so I think it is a question of tapping into the best of the tradition and placing that, you know, that treasure in conversation with the insights that emerge from, you know, from the world around us, and moving forward in terms of a vision and a mission for the entire people of God and all men and women of goodwill.
When you talk about the best of the tradition, I think that something that everybody agrees on, right, is beauty as being the essential part of the Catholic tradition, that converts are made from saints and from the art of the church, I think has been often said. And that Benedict brought the idea of beauty in the liturgy back to the fore, and I think that beauty in the liturgy, beauty in the way our church looks for goodness and truth will be essential to re-evangelizing these cultures that we're in.
Now you touched because 4 years in Italy converted me. You know, the Italians do not, when they perceive something, they do not say something is right or wrong. Ma questo è bello,
Yeah.
o questo è brutto.
Yeah.
And
Is
so
it
the
pretty or not?
aesthetic sense,
Yes,
you know,
it's true.
it's just a wonderful way of looking at life, that life is indeed beautiful, and that beauty surrounds us, empowers us, and transforms us.
Probably have time for just one or two more questions.
A couple of quick ones. It's been a half century since Vatican II. Is the church ready for Vatican III?
I think this is, as Kim said, one of those hinge moments in history, one of those kind of watershed eras. But I actually don't think that it's time for Vatican III. I think that the legacy of Vatican II still needs to be reinterpreted for our own times. I'll be curious what the...
Does that mean
others
when
say.
it's reinterpreted for our times, how far do those edges go? Certainly in the U.S., our times, people look at Vatican II and use that to say, well, that sets the stage for female priests even. I mean, I hear that from people. You know, how far are those edges and how difficult are those conversations when you talk about interpreting it for contemporary culture?
And this is where I think a pope as diplomat, or we still need a pope who's wise, who's a thinker, who's going to be able to engage the different perspectives, questions, controversies, because they're not going away, that will emerge from different parts of the world. And what we think here might be different than what, you know, the South thinks, or what. And so I think this is truly why, and to return to Patricia's and to Kim's earlier conversation, in some ways we are asking for, you know, we're asking for a lot. We're asking for a lot in terms of our leader. But I think that the key there is that the leader doesn't have to possess all of those characteristics or all of those qualities either. But if the leader possesses the holiness and the wisdom to be able to tap into that and to, you know, and to bring, you know, in his, as part of his team, those who can then delegate or search out, you know, the kinds of professional and search out the expertise that is needed to address the different issues, I think we'll be in good shape.
My tweet word was mediate, if you remember.
Here you go. Yes.
And at the same time, I think that it's important to remember just what you're saying, which is that we're not called to accommodate ourselves to our cultures. We're called to engage them. And this sometimes means the courage to be countercultural. And I think that's a message that often resonates with youth, and certainly resonates in the global South, where these are non-issues, because there are issues of feeding and protecting and caring for people that are much more salient.
One aspect of Vatican Council II was the recognition that we needed to move out to other faiths and engage them and to have a dialogue with those faiths. And I think, you know, in a way, we're at that period where we've talked a lot about secularism and the threats of secularism. But we really have to move out to other faiths and engage them in this whole issue, because really they can help us understand better our own position, and we can help them.
This is the whole dialogue of faith and culture. There's an incarnational dimension to faith, but there's also a prophetic dimension to faith. So there is dialogue and engagement, and there's also critical conversation with society. And as Margaret was saying, and I know this was part of my tenure as ambassador, engaging in conversation across religious traditions for the sake of the common good. This is essential because, you know, the world is complex, and if we're going to be able to make a dent in terms of contributing to the common good, we have but one option, and that is to engage.
Now, this might burst a little bubble in what we're doing here today, but one of the questions I think is a good one. Do the cardinals really want to listen to the laity? How could the laity manifest your concerns?
I think, of course, the Cardinals want to, I hope the Cardinals want to look to the laity, and I think that, of course, they do, because we're all part of the church. We're all part of the church from the Pope to the Cardinals to bishops and priests and the laity. We're all called to evangelize the world, and I'm sure that they want to listen to them. I think that with technology today, it's been so interesting to see. It's been so interesting, right, to see both not just the Pope tweeting, but also to see how easy it is for people to get their voices out there and for that to be heard and for a real conversation to start. Often I think technology is very difficult, but this is one place in which it's really a gift.
Amen to that. I mean, when we think of the history of the conclave, it used to be that they had to literally lock these men down, and sometimes even stories of depriving them of food so that they could elect the next pope. But the travel that they had, the distance. But what an incredible, I agree, Kim, what an incredible gift we have in terms of the social media to be able to say, again, here is, tweet the word, tweet an expression, send a letter to the cardinal, express, pray, fast during Lent. And above all, have in mind what is in the best interest of the common good of the church and of human society. And voice your.
And I'd say, by the way, that the Holy Spirit probably comes up from the bottom rather down from the top, but that's just me.
Well, one final question from me, and then we'll wrap things up. Why does it matter? I mean, many Catholics worship at a local level in their own communities, their own churches. Non-Catholics look at this and, from a distance, and it's interesting, but why does it matter? Why does this choice, how and why does it matter?
My goodness, this is, the Pope is still a symbol, right?
On this rock was built the church, and that is Peter. And therefore, that's what we look at in terms of the continuity of being a church that it goes way back to Peter.
It matters because as a world leader, at a time when the human family is so divided and oftentimes polarized, to have the kind of charismatic, holy, compassionate person calling forth the best in all of us matters. It matters a lot.
And it's so key, I think, to have a leader on the world stage who is a voice for the voiceless and a voice for the vulnerable. And to me, that's the key role of the Pope in the coming decades.
I think that's exactly what we're hoping for, a Pope who can be a voice for the voiceless.
All right. Well, thank you to you all for this great conversation. We certainly appreciate it. Thanks to our audience and everybody else who participated.